Picture, if you will, a small open boat pulling away from the Pembrokeshire shore in the failing light of an autumn afternoon in the year 1800. The water is the color of slate, and the men at the oars bend into each stroke with the patient resignation of those who have done this before and know exactly how far they must go. 20 miles out into the open Atlantic, past the last green hills of Wales, lies a cluster of jagged rocks barely worthy of a name, scattered like broken teeth across a stretch of sea so treacherous that sailors had cursed it for centuries. The locals called them the Smalls, and upon the largest of these stones, raised on slender iron legs above the reach of the waves, stood a lighthouse unlike any other in the kingdom. It was a strange and fragile thing to behold, this tower. Built less than 30 years earlier by a Liverpool maker of musical instruments named Henry Whiteside, it resembled nothing so much as a wooden cabin hoisted into the air on stilts, designed so that the great swells might pass beneath it rather than break against it. In calm weather, the idea seemed almost clever. In a storm, when the sea rose in gray mountains and the whole structure groaned and shuddered on its pillars, the men who lived inside it learned the true meaning of helplessness. The two who rowed toward it that day were keepers come to take their turn, and they understood that they were rowing into a kind of exile. For once a man climbed the ladder into that swaying box of timber and lamp oil, there was no leaving until a relief crew came to fetch him, and relief crews depended entirely upon the mercy of the weather. A spell that should have lasted weeks could stretch, without warning, into months. There was no way to call for help, no means of signaling distress that the storms would not swallow whole. And winter was coming. The men knew it in the bite of the wind and the early dark, knew that the season ahead would test the little tower as it was tested every year. What none of them could have known was how this particular winter would end. The two men who share that exile both bore the name Thomas. One was Thomas Howell, a cooper by trade, a maker of barrels whose steady hands and patient temperament would, in the months to come, be tested in ways no craft could prepare him for. The other was Thomas Griffith, of whom history has preserved far less, save for the one detail that has clung to their story ever since. For it was said, in the harbors and taverns of the Pembrokeshire coast, that the two Thomases did not get along. Whether this was true in any serious measure, or merely the kind of rumor that grows around men confined too long together, no one can now say with certainty. Some accounts insist the pair were known to quarrel openly. Others suggest the talk was idle, the invention of those who came after and needed the tale to make sense. What is not in dispute is the shape of their days. There was the lamp to be tended, its wicks trimmed, and its oil replenished through the long hours of darkness, for the light could not be allowed to fail. There was the endless watching of the weather, the rationing of food and fuel, the small economies of two men with nothing but each other and the sea for company. They slept in turns, ate in silence or in argument, and listened, always, to the groaning of the timbers beneath them. And then the weather closed in. The storms of that winter came early and stayed, one gale folding into the next until the gap between them vanished altogether. The relief boat that should have come could not approach the rock, for to attempt a landing in such seas was to invite death upon the iron legs. Weeks passed. The supplies, calculated for a shorter stay, began to dwindle. On the mainland, families watched the horizon and waited, helpless, while the little tower stood cut off as completely as if it had drifted to the far side of the world. It was sometime in this stretch of gray and endless days that one of the two men fell ill. The records do not tell us with what sickness, only that it came on gravely, and that it worsened, and that the other could do nothing but watch and tend the light, and pray for the sea to grant them passage home. The illness took Thomas Griffith, or so the most widely repeated version of the story tells us, though here again the accounts grow uncertain, some naming the dead man, and others leaving him in shadow. What seems beyond doubt is that one keeper died upon the rock, and that the survivor, alone now in the groaning tower, was left to reckon with the body of the man he had lived beside through all those endless weeks. His dilemma was a terrible one, and it has a cruel logic that lingers in the mind. The two were known, or rumored, to quarrel. Were he to commit the body to the sea, as instinct and decency might urge, he feared that when rescue finally came, he would be met not with sympathy, but with suspicion, accused of having murdered his companion and hidden the proof beneath the waves. And so he resolved to keep the body, to preserve it as best he could until witnesses could see for themselves that no violence had been done. He is said to have built a rough coffin from whatever timber and boards he could spare, and when the corpse could no longer be borne inside the cramped quarters, he lashed this makeshift box to the outer gallery, high above the breaking water, where the wind and the cold might do their slow work. But the storms tore at the lashings and worked the boards loose, and in time the wrappings parted, and through the small window the surviving keeper could see what remained of his fellow man, and the dead arm, some versions claim, was moved by the wind so that it seemed to beckon, to wave, to call. Whether that detail is true or the embroidery of later tellers, no one can now say, for it is precisely the kind of image that fastens itself to a story and refuses to let go. What is certain is that the man endured this, day upon day, alone, tending the lamp through the dark and watching the horizon for a sail that did not come. By the time the sea at last relented, something in him had given way, worn through by isolation and dread and the constant presence of the dead, and the light still turned faithful and indifferent above it all. When the boats finally came, in the latter part of 1801, the men who climbed the iron rungs into the tower found a scene they would not soon forget. They had expected hardship. What they discovered was something closer to ruin. Thomas Howell, the survivor in the most widely repeated version of the tale, was so altered by his ordeal that those who knew him are said to have struggled to recognize him at all. His face had grown gaunt and strange, his manner withdrawn, and whatever weeks of solitude and dread had done to him could not be undone by mere rescue. He had kept the light burning, faithfully, through it all, and that small fidelity had perhaps been the only thread holding him to his reason. But the man who came ashore was not the man who had rowed out, and accounts agree that he never fully returned to himself, carrying the weight of that lighthouse with him for the remainder of his days. The tragedy did not vanish in a private grief. It reached the men who governed the lights, and it forced upon them a simple and terrible arithmetic. 2 keepers could become one in an instant, and 1 keeper, left alone with a corpse in the sea, could be broken past mending. And so it was decreed in the years that followed that no lighthouse should be staffed by fewer than 3 men, so that should one die, another would never be left to face the dead alone. It was a rule written in the language of caution, but beneath it lay the memory of a wooden box lashed to a windswept gallery and a hand that seemed to beckon across the water. The story, meanwhile, refused to fade. It was told and retold along the Welsh coast and far beyond, gathering embellishments with each passing decade, until it became less a record than a kind of dark folklore, surfacing again and again in books and in films that borrowed its shape if not its facts. And out there still, on its lonely reef west of Pembrokeshire, a lighthouse keeps its vigil, the keeper's long since gone, the lamp now tended by no human hand at all, the lights still turning, faithful and indifferent above an unquiet sea.